So, assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the VOU talk show in conversation with Kazim and Petra are going to be our guests today. So we're going to be talking about Petra, mainly her Islamic, her journey to Islam, and how she found Islam and all the different challenges essentially that she might have faced along the way, and kind of what doors it opened for her as well, and how she found it being sort of integrating within the community, that kind of thing. And then we're also going to be touching on Islamophobia. So last month was Islamophobia Awareness Month, and Kazim especially did a lot of work with men who are Muslim.
Muslim engagement and development.
Yeah. So Kazim, you will be telling us about that. Well, inshallah.
Janan did lots of research before.
I did, but my mind went blank. Sorry. Right. So should we get started? Maybe you guys can introduce yourselves. So maybe your name, what you do, where you live, and then we can get started. So Petra, do you want to go first?
All right. Okay. Thank you. My name is Petra Fatima. I actually adopted Muslim name to highlight the transition from the non-Islamic to Islamic way of living. And also I kept my original name Petra, not only to remember my non-Islamic background, but also to emphasize that an ordinary person with ordinary European name can be a Muslim, and that Islam is a religion for the whole humanity and not only for specific groups of people living in the Middle Eastern, Far Eastern or African countries, as unfortunately so many non-Muslims think that this is the case. I'm currently studying for a doctorate in economics and political science via distance learning. I have 3 children, 2 boys, age of 17 and 15, and 5-year-old daughter.
Amazing, thank you, Petra. Kazim, do you want to go next? So there's a little bit of feedback from your side, I think, Petra. So if you want to just mute your mic in between, it might help. That's great.
And Kazan, I think you're muted by the sounds of it. You see your lips moving, but that's
can you hear me now?
Yeah, got it.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, I had my wireless headphones, which never seem to be reliable for these sorts of things, so I've just pulled them out. So inshallah, you can hear me okay now. So assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Firstly, thank you very much to Sister Janan and Brother Ayman for putting together the second episode of this talk show. And it's a pleasure to be here. And as you know, you guys have alluded to, by day, I'm a policy researcher at MEND, which, as Brother Ayman rightly pointed out, is Muslim Engagement and Development. So we are an organization that primarily works with not just sort of Muslim communities up and down the country, including sort of Scotland and Wales, but also with MPs, with local councils, journalists, academics, etc., in order to bring issues related to British Muslim communities to light. And sort of those of us within the policy team, it's sort of, you know, self-explanatory, work to bring these issues towards the realm of policy and to try and bring about change, inshallah, particularly in relation to Islamophobia. So that's my day job. And by night, alhamdulillah, I have the pleasure of volunteering for IUS. So I just recently took over as the chair from Brother Ayman, alhamdulillah, and I'm based in London. And sort of, you know, from a sort of Shia Muslim background. I'm sure obviously Sister Petra will be sharing her story as a revert. For me, maybe I can share some insights as you guys can, as to sort of those of us that have been born and brought up in this environment, and maybe some of the things that we tend to take for granted. I'm sure when we hear Sister Petra's story, she will shed light on some of the, obviously, the great sort of things that came about as a result of embracing Islam. But then no doubt some of the challenges and the obstacles that she faced as well. So I think that's very important for us to bear in mind, that those of us that were born onto the path of Islam sort of are very fortunate. So I tell myself that before anyone else. So yeah, looking forward to the rest of the discussion, inshallah.
Inshallah, sounds great. Thank you. Yeah, definitely. I think we're very fortunate, and we don't realise the struggles that people who end up finding Islam later in their life might have as well. So, Petra, do you want to tell us about how it all started, how you were introduced to the idea of Islam? How did you find Islam? Oh, we lost you for a second. Petra, are you still with us? No. Still finding itself.
Might be a connection thing. Kazim, do you want to talk about how you found Islam?
Oh, well, it's not nearly as it's not nearly as inspirational as the Petra story at all. But no, I mean, just maybe just sort of while Sister sort of Petra is reconnecting, inshallah, she does soon. Sort of just to mention, oh, okay, I guess it's just the three of us, but inshallah, sort of Sister Petra joins back in.
Yeah.
No, I mean, like I said, I mean, those of us that have kind of grown up sort of along the path of Islam, and just maybe giving sort of a brief introduction into something that we sort of emphasize a lot in our work, is that in many countries, despite the Islamophobia that exists here, there is a lot more Islamophobia abroad. In places like China, when we see what's happening with our Uyghur brothers and sisters, in India, under the BJP government there, and the oppression that is taking place against Muslims, you know, in Gaza as well, you know, and in many countries. We're very fortunate to be sort of, like I mentioned, sort of born and brought up, not just as Muslims, but in a country where we can freely practice Islam. Of course, you're going to have individuals out there sort of perpetrating acts of hate against Muslims. There are issues within government, within mainstream politics, within the media that are inherently Islamophobic. But I think it's sometimes, you know, nice to also look at the positives as well.
Definitely so. I know that I often sort of reflect and have so much respect and admiration for, well, people like Petra and, you know, reverts, and just for people who maybe are not like familiar with the term revert in terms of, rather than convert, but it's the idea of that we're all born Muslims, and even sorry, in Alim al-Dhar and prior to this worldly life, we've had that exposure, if you like, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're born into this world this way, but then, you know, our behaviors and our sort of learned beliefs or environmental beliefs sort of take place and take us away from Islam. And then the idea is that for people that maybe haven't been on the path of Islam, they revert and they go back to their original, you know, natural soul state, if you like. But I have massive admiration, as I was saying, because, you know, sometimes we always have to question our intentions as an individual in terms of how pure our thinking really is. And when you see people who have chosen Islam completely, in the sense that they've moved towards a religion that is not like the norm for their family or for their city or their country or anything, then there's a you know, high level of sincerity in that, and I think we all should try to question ourselves to try, inshallah, work towards that same level of sincerity and ikhlas, whereby, you know, we're choosing and we are truly submitting, in terms of Islam being someone who's like, and a Muslim being someone who submits to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will, and that we are submitting rather than just doing the same ritualistic or culturistic things that our parents did, for example. The Quran talks a lot about that as well. So I can see Petra, alhamdulillah, we've got you back. So we were just asking the question around, maybe just if you wanted to share a bit about your story and how you learnt about Islam and then, you know, made the decision to become a Muslimah.
Thank you as well, you know, for invitation to participate in today's event. It's really nice to see you. And Firstly, I would like to mention that I'm really grateful to Allah Ta'ala for providing me with the guidance and the right path. So I was able to recognize that reverting to Islam is the right decision in my life. Also, I would like to maybe just briefly summarize, something relating to my religious background. So it might be like indication why I became a Muslim. I was actually brought up as an atheist, as my parents divorced when I was 4 years old, and I lived with my mother and my grandparents. My grandfather and my grandmother were both atheists. Only my grandmother was a believer. She followed the Roman Catholic denomination of the Christianity. However, she didn't actually practice the religion because there was a communist regime in the Czechoslovakia when I was a child and I lived there. And sadly, the human rights were severely suppressed, the freedom was absent, and also the freedom of religion was prohibited. So religious studies were excluded from schools. Teachers were not allowed to mention anything about any religious perspective. And the only Charles Darwin theory of the evolution, the foundation of the atheism, was actually taught at the schools at that time. So when I was actually 6 years old, I had a complicated fracture of my arm. My ankle was broken, and also I suffered from the severe back pains. So at the age of 7, I was sent to spa for children. In fact, it was kind of like institutional establishment designed to provide physiotherapeutic treatment for either physically disabled children or children who had injuries as a result of accidents. Between the ages of 7 and 13, I would spend each year three months away from my family and the home environment. And during this period of the time, occultism and spiritualism play a really important role in my life, especially some of the, I would say, supernatural rituals, including the elements of the mysticism and magic, were very common form of entertainment for the children there, but also gradually became like an accepted form of worship and devotion. And actually, for me as a child, it was a really satisfactory feeling to combine, I would say, this a theoretical framework of the atheism with the practical aspects of the spiritualism. And when I was older, around the age 9, 10, I really became questioning if there was a possibility of existence or of hereafter. But obviously I couldn't get an answer from atheism because that ideology rejects the concept of the hereafter. So through this involvement of the spiritual practices, I was somehow able to connect with this unknown or invisible world, which was like really purely beyond the materialistic concept of the atheism. And that approach would be dominant in my life throughout my childhood until the collapse of the communism. And when actually the totalitarian communist regime was replaced with the democratic in all the Eastern and Central European countries, and it was replaced with a democratic one, different political and religious perspective swept across the region and were promoted by different governments. And I was really interested in the Far Eastern religious perspective, as I found kind of common ground with the spiritualism. So I was reading about Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, but instead of choosing a particular religious perspective and practicing, I would just pick and choose certain elements from each religious perspective, which I found appealing or suitable for my lifestyle as a teenager. So, for instance, meditation from Buddhism, the concept of the reincarnation from the Hinduism, we had lots of animals in the garden, chickens, rabbits, cats and dog. And so I became vegetarian, and I was advocating for the animal rights. I was strictly against killing animals. I also was interested in the concept of the balance between the evil forces and the high spirit, the yin-yang concept from the Buddhism. So I became pacifist. But what I really missed, it was kind of the collective worship, or the social interaction with the other people who were interested in the hereafter. And as not people that we knew.
So I was just going to ask you, actually, sorry to sort of, I know you sort of to cut you off, but I think two things that were, I think, really important to understand is when you were going through, especially when you said through your sort of childhood, you started to create a connection with spirituality. Was this something that, like, personally as an individual, or was it something that as a group people had this sort of feeling and that you were discussing it with other people, or was this something very private? And then the second question, maybe to also cover, was just when you were becoming like a bit more of an activist in things like animal rights and things. So what age were you around this time? Just so that, you know, us and the sort of viewers understand where you are in the story, basically.
Okay. So as a child, I had so many questions, and obviously children are curious. So I would ask my mom, who was a really firm atheist, and she wouldn't just provide me any kind of logical answers. So I think that's why I have the need somehow to look beyond that, you know, atheism. And that's why the idea of the spiritualism and occultism was so attractive to me. And then later, you know, when actually I had access to different religious perspectives, as previously I didn't during the communist regime, all the religious ideologies were prohibited. So later on, when actually I heard something about Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, I immediately started reading about those different ideological perspectives.
And would that be through like the library and reading books, or was it through, you know, there was accessibility to people like I don't know, like Buddhist people that you knew, or how did you sort of do that research?
Well, you know, I didn't know anyone who was sharing the same kind of interest, and I live in a very small town. Everything was so new, you know, after the communism collapse, but I really watched the television quite often, and I was really interested in the documentaries. And when I actually the documentaries about those Far Eastern religious, you know, kind of ideologies, I really wanted to know more about it. But really, as you know, I couldn't practice it with the other people, then I was rather interested in the mainstream monotheistic religion, the Judaism and Christianity. And as there were few churches in the town I lived, I decided to visit one of the church. And shortly after, there were lessons about catechism. I attended for the whole year those catechism lessons, where I learned a lot about Christianity and the different denomination of the Christianity. And I decided to convert to Christianity. So at the age of 16, I was Christian. At the age of 17, I was baptized. But meanwhile, I was also under the heavy influence of the Western culture, as all my friends were atheists and they attended, you know, music clubs and, you know, some rock kind of festivals. Yeah. And I'm just afraid that I might lose all my friends. So under this kind of peer pressure, you know, I was attending those places as well. So I would just describe it that, you know, I was, you know, caught up in this kind of religious and cultural turmoil, you know, through my teenage years. Yeah. But when I was actually 18, I had certain doubts about the Christianity. You know, I had especially doubts about the concept of the Holy Trinity or the right purpose of testimonies to priests, and also about the effectiveness of the prayers to the Jesus Christ, the Saint Mary, or the Saint Patrons, as my prayers were mainly directed, you know, to Jesus Christ or the Saint Patrons, but not directly to the God. And I really miss that direct interaction between myself and the God or the Creator.
Mm. Wow.
And this kind of, this kind of state of confusion would remind, or I would be influenced by it until I moved from the Czech Republic, when I moved at age of 19 to Austria, and later at age of 20 and a half, I arrived to United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And as all know, London is very multicultural, cosmopolitan, and here is very large, Muslim society. That was the first time that I actually saw a Muslim person. So I was 20 and a half, and that was the first time that I saw Muslim.
And had you heard about Islam before that?
Interestingly, yes, I heard about Islam, but as I mentioned that, I was reading about all those, different religious perspective, and also the monotheistic religion, the Judaism and Christianity. The only religion that I didn't want to know anything about was Islam. Astaghfirullah to say that, the reason for it, that when I was a child, I saw so many negative video footages on the television. They were depicting the war conflicts, the ethnic clashes in the Muslim countries, and very often they would refer to Islamic religion as the main contributor behind, those conflicts. And also when I was around the age 14, 15, I read a book which was bestseller at that time. So many girls, they read it, at my age. And the title of the book was like, Without My Daughter, I'm Not Leaving. And it was a story about a young American woman with her Iranian husband moved to Iran. And she would describe the atmosphere after the post-Islamic revolution. And in an extremely negative way, how the regime was oppressive, how women were discriminated, how the cruelty, that the Muslim women would face. So everything that I heard and I saw was negative. And I could say that as a teenager, I had this stereotypical views about Islam, and I had definitely prejudices against Muslim. And all I knew was that Muslims believe in one God, but I assumed that Islam was not a peaceful religion, and that women were really oppressed. And I just somehow didn't want to know anything about that. So sadly to say, Islam, I wasn't interested in Islam at all.
Yeah.
Interesting. And I know the viewers want to get to the juicy bit about when you're going to start explaining about and how you came across Islam further and obviously made the decision. But I just probably wanted to bring in Kazim as well, just from a very different perspective in terms of, we've just heard how Petra grew up almost like in a communist environment, quite anti-religion, quite atheist and secular. But like, I'm pretty sure, as in, I think, Kazim, are you born and bred from sort of London, South London? And I assume, within the sort of the community, you've always had that Islamic community and a sort of local masjid or mosque to Islamic center to go to. So maybe just share the contrast and feel free to obviously bring in some of your professional experience in that whole world.
Inshallah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to follow what Sister Petra just mentioned, in the sense that it's so inspirational. And sort of it's a very, very unique story, mashallah, to hear that Sister Petra sort of went from sort of country to country, was exposed to various different sort of faith groups. I don't know about you, but when I was sort of 20 and a half, 21, I had barely left my house, even studying at university in London at home. But yeah, no, Brother Ayman. So I was born in London. I've lived in London my whole life. And, London has over 1 million Muslims. So more than 10% of the population of London is Muslim, which is more than, the vast majority of non-Muslim countries. Just in London alone. In the UK, it's about 3.5 million or so. But yeah, like, I've got, within 15 minutes drive of my house, I've got 3 sort of Shia centers specifically, but there are many more sort of masajid in general. So it's more a case of like, take your pick rather than actually, where can I go? you know, compared to, you know, people like, I've got relatives in Australia, and they have to drive nearly an hour to get to their nearest Husseiniya, which is crazy. And as I mentioned before, something that a lot of us take for granted. So sort of my faith and my identity as sort of a young sort of British Muslim has always been fundamental to my upbringing. And having been born to two parents that were born into Islam themselves, that obviously has a huge impact on you. And sort of, you know, when I was growing up, the vast majority of my friends, although since I've gone to university, that's changed somewhat, but all of my friends really when I was growing up were Muslim. So your friend circle, your family circle can be very important in shaping who you are as a person. And that's why I would say, you know, for myself and many of us involved within IUS, we're doing kind of what we're doing because of the fact that sort of Islam is inbuilt within our own characters. And that's not us blowing our own trumpet. It's sort of, you know, whichever point we are in life, we're always going to have faith within us because of the fact that that was something that was almost inculcated within us and sort of embedded within our hearts when we were younger. So that's a little bit about sort of me personally, but just to briefly draw on what Sister Petra mentioned in regard to sort of perceptions of Islam, you know, there are many sort of academic and journalistic studies that show how heavily biased the media particularly can be against Islam. You know, so when you've never met a Muslim in your life, right, if you're living, for example, in Eastern Europe, you know, sort of post-communist Eastern Europe, and you've never met a Muslim, you're going to listen to sort of, number one, those in power and authority, right, politicians, and number two, the media. And of course, you know, in the 90s, for example, media was very different. Now with sort of social media, there is sort of a great deal of Islamophobia. We saw after, you know, the Euro 2020 final against sort of England's black players, Sancho, Rashford and Saka, you know, how much racism they endured as a result of essentially miskicking a football, right? If we want to put it down to that, but the amount of racism that they faced, and it's the same with Muslims, and within the media, you know, the sort of a really large proportion of articles. It depends sort of which studies you look at. So rather than going to statistics, just looking at it for what it is, the media, particularly in the UK, is sort of dominated by a sort of certain few people, right? Like Trevor Murdoch, for example. So you look at the Sun, you look at the Daily Mail, you look at the Daily Telegraph, even the Times, they all peddle the same sort of narrative of Muslims being violent, being quote unquote extremists. Whenever there is sort of an act of violence in which the perpetrator happens to be Muslim, straight away it's portrayed as a terrorist act. Whereas if it's a crime perpetrated by someone from a non-Muslim background, we'll be very quick to say, oh, you know, they had X motive and Y motive, mental health issues, they were a loner, etc., etc. So that's not at all surprising what Sister Petra mentioned, and that's why we see so much hate crime and Islamophobia, not just in the UK, but in the US, in France, in Italy, and across the world, really. And a lot of the time it comes down to who controls the media, right? In places like India, for example, in China, when you've got sort of many media outlets that are sort of strongly influenced, if not completely controlled by the state, that it's no surprise to see, you know, Muslims being, you know, physically assaulted on the streets. You know, as you see, it's less common here, but certainly in places like India, you know, there are cases in for example, Gujarat, when Narendra Modi was actually the governor of that state, and ironically, Gujarat is kind of where my lineage is from, and you saw, you know, sort of pogroms where there were 1,500, 2,000 Muslims killed in a very small period of time. And obviously with the Christchurch massacre that happened a few years ago, where there were, I think it was 51 sort of innocent Muslims were gunned down by a far-right white supremacist terrorist, it's not all that surprising. It's very sad to say that these sorts of things happen. And a lot of it does come from the media, from politicians as well, and from within, unfortunately to say, from within our own government. So, I mean, a lot of what Sister Petra sort of said resonated with me, and in sort of some of the work that I've done. And also, it's not, for example, just a phenomenon that would be, for example, visible in Eastern Europe. Like I said, it's very much sort of an international, global phenomenon, is Islamophobia.
Yeah, definitely. So, considering all the bad things that you heard, Petra, about Islam, how did you get past that? You know, having that kind of prejudice in your head, you know, you're thinking you're blocking all the Islamic, anything Islamic coming in, you're blocking it.
Does it sound like the best advertisement at the moment? So yeah, we'll pick up in your story and see what happened next.
So how did you get past that? How did you, you know, change? How did you change your mind, basically?
It was actually the fact that, you know, I actually saw the Muslims and I was really curious, and I consider myself as open-minded person, but generally, you know, whenever I went, because at the beginning I lived in London, then I would see the Muslims on daily basis, and so I thought either there is something wrong with what I think, or there must be something unusual, you know, with the community as a whole. So I remember that, you know, I watched, you know, with interest the groups of Muslim women, and I would just, you know, I would just try to think whether they're aggressive or hostile, or if there was something unusual in the behavior, and I couldn't see anything. It was the opposite of that. I thought that they were polite, well-mannered, and out of the curiosity, I decided to visit Islamic Center, and luckily I met an English convert there who immediately recognized that I wasn't practicing Muslim from the way I was dressed up. I have tight jeans and jeans jacket and scarf, you know, I didn't tie it properly. So she approached me, and there was a little bit of language barrier because I couldn't speak English. I learned only German and Russian languages in Czechoslovakia, and the reason I came to UK was to work and to learn English language. But she was so patient, and she really, you know, wanted to establish kind of friendship. So we would communicate with each other, and we would see each other occasionally. And shortly after, I met my husband, who wasn't practicing Islam, but he talked very nicely with respect about Islam, and he would also explain me the differences between different denominations of the Islam, especially the Sunni and Shia. So in 1 year time, when I went to visit my family relatives, I borrowed a Quran in the Czech language, and I photocopied every single page of that book, and I read all of it. And there are certain passages in the Quran that I couldn't understand quite clearly, or, you know, I found it a little bit confusing, as I didn't learn tafsir at that time. So I was basically like trying to understand word by word, which obviously it's not possible. But surprisingly, I was able to find some answers to my question that I had as a child and as a teenager, and that was mainly relating to the creation of the earth, creation of the universe, and how the life evolved and how it came into existence on this planet. And that was really important in my life, that finally I could find the answers to my fundamental questions, which the other religious perspective, they couldn't provide me with those answers. And I decided to say my Shahada, and I became Muslim, and gradually, you know, I started practicing the religion, and especially, you know, the Islamic etiquette was like so pleasantly surprising for me, because such a simple things like saying Bismillah before we eat, or after finish eating, you know, I felt how huge impact is got it on my life, that I become more humble, I become more altruistic, I had more empathy for the others, you know, giving the donation to the charity, and I was, you know, it's like the whole world opened in front of me, and I was thinking on a different level.
Wow. Yeah, and that's really interesting, because a lot of people think that Islam is just kind of, you know, you follow rules and you pray and you fast and do X, Y, Z. But it's a way of life. Like, it's just the way that you live your life, by these ethical morals. And Islam is just so amazing in the sense that everything has been given to us. Like, even things that are got nothing to do with like halal haram, but it's just like, you know, when you eat like this, it's good to sit this way and it's good to speak this way, and like just so many different things and so much guidance and how to live our life in the best possible way. And I think that makes Islam very unique. And it's something that actually I've not really thought about until more recently. But yeah.
I think one thing that you said that really resonated, and I think it's probably not, it goes back to my earlier point around people like really living Islam and how much of it is just cultural versus how much of it is real, like in a like the soul expressing itself. And there's obviously thawab anyway in terms of, you know, saying Bismillah before food, but you know, maybe like partly the way some people are brought up in terms of if they're born into a Muslim family is that it's just what you do. It's just they've seen it all their life. People say Bismillah before they eat, but they've never really sort of almost been mindful of it and really felt it and thought about it. And so I think, as you said, like the way the world opens up in front of you, I think it's like you see everything in a complete different way. And I don't want to promote specific films, but it's almost like for any of you who are fans of The Matrix, like when the idea of someone is opened up to the Matrix, like the real, from the Matrix to the real world, everything is different, and they see the world a completely different way. So it's it's sort of amazing to hear that there's that thing.
Yeah, so I got a question, which actually good question, because I was thinking that too. So out of curiosity, doesn't Judaism or Christianity give way of life to, for example, joint prayer before food, etc.? So like doing grace before having food, something that Christians do a lot. So did you not have that before, or were you just not practicing it? Or?
Well, actually, I would attended the Sunday masses, and I participated in the congregational prayers on Sundays. But at the time that, you know, I attended the church and I had, you know, few friends who were Christians, we didn't really practice the religion in our home. So it wasn't organized in the way that, you know, there would be a specific time that we would go and pray. We wouldn't really say Amen, you know, after we would finish the food. And, you know, at home, when I was at home, actually, as I mentioned, my mom was atheist, my grandfather was atheist as well. So they didn't really like the idea that, you know, I would practice any kind of religion in the home environment. But not really, I wouldn't really pray, you know, apart if I wasn't at a church. And at that time, it was something new, because I also mentioned that there was a communist regime where even the churches were closed and synagogues were closed, and any kind of worship was basically, public worship was forbidden. And after like 2-3 years, when gradually, you know, those religious perspectives were, you know, coming, you know, into the region of the Central Europe, then gradually, you know, the official authorities, they would open up, you know, the doors of the churches, and they would allow people to go. So it was a little bit kind of like new to most of the people there. And yeah, I mean, if there is not really kind of support, you know, I think from your family or even from your friends, is really quite hard, you know, to practice the religion. I mean, as a teenager, not as an adult. And I mean, as a teenager, you know, most teenagers, they're affected by kind of the emotional turbulence, and I think they need a little bit of guidance, which I really didn't have it at that time. And I think that's why, you know, I was so confused, and I was just looking for kind of different sources of information, and I just couldn't get the answers that, you know, I was looking for.
And I think importantly, it's that, you know, even like Judaism, Christianity, like Islamically, we don't actually believe that they are separate religions. Like when the Quran talks about these, they talk about the people, so it's followers of this, or as in
the Christians,
the Jews, rather than Judaism and Christianity as a thing. and in the end, you know, we believe like hundreds, over 124,000 prophets that taking people towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's sort of a gradual journey with that. So it's not like a sort of necessarily a competition, but I think it highlights actually a risk whereby you maybe see it in other religions, and definitely even within the Muslim community, where, as you say, like the faith is practiced in specific areas. So when you go to the masjid, you're a Muslim, and then maybe at home you're a Muslim, but then when you go out in the streets, you're just a normal person, normal in quotation marks, or when you're at work, you're just another employee doing your job. And that's a huge problem, because then we have almost like created like a duality of like a double standard in terms of two parts of our lives, when Islam is something that's within us all the time. So whether it's eating food, driving to work, writing a report for your boss, or whatever, like all of that should be in the sort of this context of fi sabilillah, and like, you know, for the sort of closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in terms of our intentions, and that there isn't that sort of Islam fire, if you like, never burns out, and it never like is confined to a specific building or something like that. I don't know, that's really interesting.
And Petra, can you tell us, so were you, when did you start wearing the hijab then? How did you find that journey or that side of it?
Right, actually shortly after I reverted to Islam, and I said to my Shahada, just a few days after, you know, I decided to do the scarf, but I received fairly kind of negative reaction from my family relatives. So I was in the doubt whether I should, you know, wear my scarf when I wanted to visit them. But I made a decision that, you know, it's really important, you know, to practice the fundamental aspects of the religion, and not to be influenced by negative comments of others, even if these are, you know, the immediate family members, or, you know, the parents.
Mm-hmm.
And do you feel that your family still haven't accepted it to this day, or is it, as in, what's your relationship like now, sort of further down the line? Have you spoken to them about your journey in Islam, or is it something that you discuss?
Well, I mean, the vast majority of my friends were very critical, but my parents, they had slightly different approach. I mean, my mother was more open-minded, but also skeptical. But having experienced those my previous, you know, temporary religious episode, she just thought it was kind of social experiment for me. But I wanted to try something new, and after a few months, I would abandon the religion and I would return back to atheism.
Like being a vegetarian. She just thought, oh, it's like being a vegetarian for.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So many changes, you know, in my life that she just couldn't believe that I would stick with that.
I see.
But in contrast, my father, I think I mentioned that my parents, they divorced when I was little. So I didn't have contact with my father as a child. But when I was 18, I really wanted to establish this relationship, daughter and father. So I visited him and we talked with each other. And somehow, you know, we established that kind of, you know, relationship between the daughter and father. And even we would talk with each other when I live in Austria and, you know, in United Kingdom. But when I actually made the announcement that I reverted to Islam, he was very serious and very angry. And I knew that, you know, he was holding this very negative views about Islam, and he had very strong prejudices against Muslims. So we wouldn't talk each other for maybe a year and a half or 2 years. But after that, I just thought that rather than focusing what divide us, it would be maybe better just to somehow focus on what unite us and something what we had in common. And what we really like both is outdoor activities. you know, like cycling and mountain climbing and camping during the summer season and skiing and ice skating during winter season. So when I went to visit my family, relatives, and him after like 3 years, I suggested if we could go together for a cycling trip. He was really shocked because he thought that I wasn't allowed to cycle. And when I actually explained to him that there was nothing in contradiction with the Islamic doctrine, he was really surprised and he agreed. So we went together for 10 days cycling trip. We went by train to Austria, and then we only cycle in the southern region, Austria. We cycle from in Slovenia from north to south, the southern east part of Italy, and 1/3 of the Croatian seaside, and then we returned back. But the first few days I was really very anxious because I thought that either we're gonna have like terrible arguments or we will not talk with each other at all. And as my father had this paper map, and we somehow had to plan what we're gonna do the following day, and also before the sunset we have to decide where we're gonna sleep, where we're gonna build the tents. And we had so many experiences because we almost cycled 800 kilometers during this 10 journey. So we started to talk with each other about the plans, about our experiences, and suddenly, that was the breaking point, and we talked with each other again. I mean, during that journey, we wouldn't talk about the religion. I thought that was too dangerous. That as soon as we would go back into the routine. But actually, the following year, when I again, visited him, I again suggested if we could go together, but this time to visit a Muslim country, and we went to Turkey. We went by train, and we have the bicycles on the train, travel through the night and the day. And when we arrived to Istanbul, we would cycle for 13 days in the Turkey. And again, just with this paper map, and we would just look at the interesting spots, and mainly we would cycle in those rural, very remote areas far away from the tourist popular destinations. And when we would actually stop for the refreshment in those villages, very often the little children or the elderly people would come approach us, and when they saw our bicycles, with the big bags on the back wheel and the front wheels, they would be just curious. And when I mentioned that I was Muslim and my father was Catholic, they were really surprised, and they were very friendly. A few times they invited us for a refreshment and a meal, and on 2 occasions the locals contacted the imam, who came to us and unlocked the small mosque that was in the village, and that was the first time that my father entered the mosque, and that was finally that was my opportunity to talk with him about some of the the fundamental aspects of the Islamic religion. And ended up the journey, we also visited the Blue Mosque in the Istanbul, and I mean, overall it was really good experiences because finally, I could talk to him of something that I couldn't imagine like 3-4 years ago. And since then, we actually participated in another 4 cycling journeys, including in 2017, we went together to Albania and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Actually, we didn't go by train. I drove, through Germany, Austria, along the Croatian seaside, Montenegro to Albania. And Albania is long but quite narrow country. So we drove from the west to the east and back. And again, we would stop at different places. And again, there were some, like a small a mosque that we would visit. But I really wanted my father to see the most Muslim graves in the Sarajevo and the Srebrenica. So instead of going back the same road, we would go to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we would visit, you know, those two places. And when we actually stood in this, you know, mass graveyard, and we could see the thousands of, you know, Muslim graves, I finally could talk to him also about the suffering of the Muslims,
Yeah.
and how much injustice is happening in different parts of the world. And after that, my father was completely changed the way he was thinking about Islam and the Muslims. Previously, for instance, he thought that Serbs have the right, you know, invade and occupy some of the parts of the Bosnia Herzegovina and Kosovo in the 90s, and he supported Serbs. Whereas when we actually spent these 2 or 3 hours, you know, at those graveyards, he was actually crying, and he would just said to me, "That's unbelievable," because finally, you know, we could discuss it openly, and yeah, we have amazing, you know, relationship now. He's very tolerant. We even
that's really nice.
That's so lovely to hear, and I think
amazing.
It's amazing. It really highlights how the individual is so important in terms of, like, it's both your experience in terms of you meeting Muslim for the first time in London, and then the sort of the sister at the mosque in terms of the scholar who is helping you, and then also your experiences, like with you being the Muslim that is explaining Islam, if you like, to your father. Just shows how as individuals we have a big responsibility in terms of to try and sort of live Islam in action and represent that. And yeah, and we've been lucky enough to travel to Bosnia, and you know, go to Mostar, Sarajevo, and like these amazing places, and it's such a wonderful country. And it's interesting that you mentioned it, because I think, as you were talking before a bit about race, the idea of, like, sometimes people think Muslim, they think of, you know, black hair and some like a Arab style like skin color, and it's a Middle Eastern thing. But obviously, like, it's nothing to do with ethnicity. And you see that very clearly in Bosnia. Like, when we were there, I'd sometimes see, like, it just looks like an English person, but basically a white man, blonde hair, blue eyes, clean shaven. He was like running, and then I see him like doing wudu really quickly, and it's because the adhan is going, and it's Salat Jum'ah, and he wants to try catch the Jum'ah, and it's like it sort of just makes you realize that sometimes we have these stereotypes of what Islam looks like, and have an image. I think, did you say that there was a question? I know
Yeah,
that
sorry, there were a couple of questions, and I think I'm wary of time. The first question is, we have Muslim girls, ladies, that either don't wear hijab or actually took it off. From your personal perspective, what is hijab, and why did you decide to wear it? Big question.
Right. I mean, when I reverted to Islam and when I start practicing the fundamental, you know, principles, then wearing hijab was so important to me, because I just believe that, you know, I have kind of new Muslim identity, and I just feel that I wanted to be visible. You know, also, you know, I have experienced some like religious discrimination, as well as the Islamophobic attacks, especially verbal abuses or insults. Wearing the hijab makes me feel that I'm actually the ambassador for Islam. And sometimes even that the people would have hostile attitude towards me. I think this is the opportunity that I could perhaps, you know, respond, you know, to them. It's really important that, you know, the way how we respond, that it's not in the aggressive or the hostile way that sometimes, you know, they would use against us, but try to actually explain them, and sometimes to get engaged with them. I mean, obviously it depends on the situation, you know, if you see that the person, you know, it's quite reasonable and would be able to talk, you know, with you about the religious perspective, then I try, you know, to find out what is behind, you know, this kind of aggressivity. And very often, you know, I notice that is just kind of fear, ignorance and lack of education. And it really reminds me when I was a teenager and I had this Islamophobic, kind of ideas. And so, by wearing the scarf, I'm proud, I'm to show that I'm a Muslim. And also, it's part of my life. I couldn't imagine being Muslim without wearing the scarf. But that's perspective. I know that there are so many Muslim ladies who practice the Islam, but they choose not to wear it. I think everyone's got a different kind of views regarding religion.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. And I suppose, Kazim, this is probably really relevant to a lot of the stuff that you've seen. I think Janan was just asking me earlier on this week about what gender Islamophobia was, in terms of like, it's one of these, like, Islamophobia is now maybe a growing sort of term that's being used. November was Islamophobia Awareness Month, and so there's been some activity around that. I know that you've been directly involved in it as well from a MEND perspective, and IUS have done some work, and this is almost linked to it. But yeah, maybe just talking a bit about the sort of the hijab Islamophobia sort of coalescence.
Yeah, no, so you're right. So the term sort of like gendered Islamophobia, because sort of statistics, and within MEND, we have sort of a branch called the Islamophobia Response Unit, which sort of provides pro bono, so free legal support to anyone that has been the victim of an Islamophobic hate crime. If my memory serves me correctly, in the last sort of 4 years since the IOU was formed, we've dealt with more than 1,000 cases. And actually the majority of those are from visibly Muslim women. So when we say visibly, we say those that sort of wear the hijab, so the headscarf, the niqab, which is sort of the face covering, or sort of like the abaya, or like the sort of the chador, something that is sort of distinctively sort of, it's very heavily cultural, but often also perceived as being religious. And that's often the case. And those that often perpetrate Islamophobic crimes in the UK are middle-aged men, right? Often white men as well. And that's just because, well, we live in the UK, and the majority of men are from like sort of a white Christian background. So proportionally speaking, they would be white. So, as mentioned, sort of, Sister Petra talking about the fact that sort of the hijab is a symbol of her Islamic faith. For many non-Muslims and Islamophobes, I should be saying, rather than sort of non-Muslims in general, for Islamophobes specifically, the hijab sort of makes that person a target, and a visible target, and also sort of almost the sort of sexist perception that women are sort of less likely to retaliate. They're less likely to sort of fight back, either against verbal abuse or against physical abuse. You often sort of hear about cases of employment discrimination in the workplace against Muslim women, particularly those that wear the hijab. For example, customers or clients. It's very common within the NHS, actually, when you have female doctors or nurses. There have actually been cases of patients that are, for example, suffering from COVID, and a hijabi lady comes in to kind of, nurse them, and the person turns around and says, no, I don't want that person. Really? And sort of, yeah. Wow. And calls them all sorts of terms. I've, read articles about that. So it's like people will go to great lengths, even if they're almost dying, to actually spew hatred against individuals. And sort of coming just back onto sort of when we talk about kind of the racialized side of Islamophobia, and those sort of preconceived notions of what a Muslim looks like. If someone were to see myself or Brother Ayman in the street, they might not automatically presume that we're Muslim. But actually something that I was really shocked to hear about was the first person to die after 9/11 in the US in an Islamophobic hate crime was a Sikh man that had a turban on, right? And that's because of the fact that racists and Islamophobes and bigots, they just generalize about all of us. There are 1.5 billion of them. They all look the same. They're all terrorists. Muslim women are oppressed, right? That was a big narrative when the US invaded Afghanistan. This sort of notion that Muslim women need saving, that they're under Taliban rule. They're being forced to go out wearing the burqa. But the problem was that the government line was then sort of applied to Muslim women universally, right? However many hundreds of millions of Muslim women there are around the world. And that's sort of the tragic thing. And when we see sort of Sikhs being targeted and sort of non-Muslims in general because of the fact that they're sort of perceived to be Muslim, you know, that shows how sort of racially driven, firstly, Islamophobia is, and secondly, how much it's based on ignorance. That they see someone with a thick beard and a turban, they assume, you know, this guy looks like, for example, you know, without giving names, we all know who we're talking about. Their names don't even deserve to be mentioned. But after 9/11, people seeing the leader of Al-Qaeda being sort of shown on the news, or for example, the leader of the Taliban after the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, it's like this Sikh man looks like them, therefore they're terrorists, therefore we have to attack them. But a lot of the time it's sort of based on visible markers, and that's why sort of the hijab is so important. But sadly, it's often sort of the reason for why innocent Muslim women are targeted in these crimes. So that's why, sort of speaking as obviously a sort of a Muslim guy, you know, I have the utmost respect for sort of the Muslim women that kind of go out and, you know, they're not without being sort of apologetic about their faith. But they're actually kind of, you know, going out and sort of wearing the hijab, where especially those that, you know, I've got a colleague at Men, for example, that wears the niqab, but she's, mashallah, always taking part in events, sort of driving forward, you know, for example, our initiatives in Islamophobia Awareness Month. And you know, I'm sure you know, sort of Brother Ayman as well, sort of you would agree that these ladies are very much sort of the flag bearers and the ambassadors of the faith, and those that we kind of have the utmost respect for, because as men, we can't sort of imagine a lot of the sort of challenges that they would go through based on, for example, the hijab and the other sort of not necessarily requirements, but sort of, you know, a lot of the challenges that come with being a visibly Muslim women in Western society.
I mean, it's even small things like, you know, if you go, you know how they say when you go for an interview, they've already formed their opinion about you within 5 seconds or something like that.
First impressions.
Yeah.
So if they happen to have a bad impression about Muslims, instantly they've ruled you out in their head when you've not even said a word. So yeah, it is challenging, but alhamdulillah.
And I think it's also really concerning when this sort of stereotype it becomes institutionalized. So you think, like you mentioned sort of the US situation, but then I think it was after the 7/7 bombings, there was a Brazilian guy who was just had some headphones or something, was listening, so it looked like wires. Well, it was wires, but it was just headphones. And the UK police like shot him dead. Yeah, they thought it was a terrorist threat, and he probably wasn't Muslim, and he obviously wasn't as an actual threat. But again, that sort of perception sort of just becomes ingrained, and it's even more dangerous when it's ingrained with people who have got firearms and a license to use them.
So I think the last question, I think we'll try and be a little bit quick because we're running over time, but I think it's really important to discuss this. Last question for you, Petra, is how have you found it integrating within the Muslim community in the UK? Have you had any challenges? And what can we do as a community to welcome reverts and support them in this journey?
Alhamdulillah, you know, I received really very pleasant and kind reactions, you know, from the members of the Muslim community. I think the only dilemma might arise when I mentioned that I'm a revert, that the Muslim sisters try to find out if I know enough about their religion, but I'm really open-minded, and I'm always willing to listen, you know, when they try to give me certain advices or recommendations, and I'm always happy, you know, to discuss, you know, anything that is related to the religious perspective. And I think that active engagement is so important between the reverts and the members of the Muslim community, that very often, you know, I mean, I would remember the few months, after, I reverted to Islam, I was quite shy, especially, I was trying to cope with the different lifestyle, but also the different reaction, from the members of the public, because obviously whenever someone would look at me, I immediately thought it's because of my hijab. So it took me some while, to get used to this different lifestyle. And what really helped me was, for instance, as I mentioned, the positive attitudes of the English convert sister, who was so kind and encouraged me. And yeah, I think it's definitely about this positive attitude and, the cooperation of both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think we don't. Well, I've not been exposed to that many reverts, but I wonder whether it's because we've not sort of reached out to them as much as we should have, and maybe that's why, I've not met that many of them, or if there's really not that many of them out there, but I'm sure there is. But we're probably not doing enough to welcome them and make them feel a bit more, part of the community, because it's a massive change in culture as well.
That's probably one of the big things, is that some Islamic centers are based on culture, and they're not masajid or mosques. They are cultural centers, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, in that they're not allowed to be cultural centers. Some places can be a cultural center, whether it's a specific heritage and a style and a language that they use. But we always need to be aware that there has to be a space, whether it's a different center, different organization, or the same center but has a sort of an entity within it, if you like, that is very open and is the pure Islamic open part of it, that is obviously much more accommodating to people, whether it's language or style and things like that. Because if you become a revert, it doesn't mean you have to get used to eating spicy food, for example, because maybe that's something that might be associated with a culture that ends up becoming a mosque culture, when it's important to sort of separate those things. And I think the element of how it's like Islamophobia and the work that you do with even the non-Muslim community is obviously quite crucial. So whether it's local community, in terms of in the geography of a mosque and the work that they do, that sort of like accessibility is really important for people to understand what's happening in the mosque, because then that can potentially create a pathway for people who do want to learn more about Islam. And in your example, Petra, like you were using things like documentaries, and then when you started to meet people, that was a big thing for you. So mosques and Muslims need to be more open. Kazim, would actually be quite probably crucial, just on the point of some of the Islamophobic side, because there's obviously the negative side, and there's been lots of cases of mosques being damaged and things like that and vandalized. But in terms of how people would report it, so anyone who might be listening, in terms of if they have been a victim of an Islamophobic attack, or even just something that might have been said to them, or a slur or something like that, where would you point them to go?
Yeah, no, thank you, Brother Ayman. That's a really sort of important question, and I'm glad that you brought it up. So as I mentioned, and this isn't me just sort of plugging MENS, but as mentioned, we do have something called the Islamophobia Response Unit, the IRU, and sort of we deal with cases, and it's very important to emphasize that Islamophobia is not just sort of verbal and physical abuse, as we would sort of call it. That's what hate crime is. That's sort of the most sort of overt form. But for example, we've dealt with cases of students that have been bullied in school. We've dealt with cases of, for example, within a school where, the students don't have any place to pray. And sort of parents and the students have requested, well, can they have a prayer facility, whether it's just a classroom every day at, for example, Dhuhr Asr time, and the school have refused. And then we've kind of intervened. There are obviously cases of employment discrimination as well, where, for example, you feel that, your contract at work, for example, has been unlawfully terminated because of the fact that you're a Muslim, where you've been denied leave for Eid, for Hajj, all of these different aspects. This is what sort of Islamophobia is. It's sort of, there are these more kind of invisible, subtle forms of marginalization and exclusion that we don't always see. So these are all different things that should be reported. So you can go to iru.mend.org.uk. And then, like I said, we have a legal team, sort of with, sort of those that are trained in law and those studying law that work as caseworkers, who provide sort of free legal support and also emotional support as well. So I'm sure many of you, sorry, just conscious of time, so I'll just sort of mention this one anecdote, but I'm sure many of you heard of the case of the Somalian sister, Zainab Hussein, who about 3 years ago was run over twice in Leicester after dropping her children to school. So she's a Somalian lady in the hijab, and she was bedridden for more than 6 months. There was an interview that the BBC did with her 6 months after the atrocity that was committed by a white supremacist. And it gave her great emotion, physical grief, but this was something that sort of the IRU helped with in terms of her legal case. So anyone is able to report whether you've kind of experienced that severity of crime, because whenever or something a little bit more, like I said, a bit subtle. If someone, for example, yells at you, calls you the P word, or tells you go back to your country, those are all forms of Islamophobia. And it's really important to stress that if we don't report it, then the police aren't going to understand the scale of Islamophobia, and therefore the government won't. But if we report it, give more kind of accurate data as to the scale of Islamophobia in the UK, then it's a lot more likely that people will stand up and realize, from within our own communities as well, by the way. You have people within our own communities that sort of tend to undermine the severity of Islamophobia in the UK. And then therefore we can build a greater picture of what Islamophobia is, and thereby sort of taking steps to tackle it, inshallah.
And Kazim, is that link? Is there a link with? I think it's tellmama.org, maybe, or tellamama.com. Is that another reporting place? And is there a link?
Yeah. So it's Tell Mama. So yeah, you can obviously also visit their website. They particularly deal with kind of cases of hate crimes specifically, sort of verbal and physical. But yeah, that's another sort of website. So definitely these are sort of outlets, and obviously, if it's something that is sort of quite a bit more serious in terms of the physical severity, obviously call the police. Don't sort of, just let it go under the carpet and sort of presume, that no one's going to do anything about it, because, we do have the police that record Islamophobic hate crimes as Islamophobic hate crimes, not just hate crimes or racialism or whatever. And they do record and recognize Islamophobia, sort of the Met Police, and sort of across the country as well. So there are a few different outlets there, as you mentioned as well.
Mm-hmm.
Cool, thank you, Kazim. That's really helpful. I think before we end, I'm just conscious that I accidentally missed out a comment or a question for you, Petra. So we'll just quickly cover that, and then that's it. I'll end it, inshallah, for tonight. So the question is, what would you say if someone said to you that Muslim girls can practice dignity / morality and good ethics, but they don't have to cover up or wear the hijab, for example? How would you go about that argument? What would you say back to them?
I assume it depends on the situation. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, even, amongst the Muslim sisters, there are different views regarding wearing the hijab. And I have few, friends that they practice Islam and they don't wear hijab. So I do not discriminate, I really respect them, and, they have great personalities. We have always something to talk about. I think it's important to respect, each other, regardless. And already I would go a little bit back to what I said earlier, that if we're gonna really focus on something what divide us, it might cause, difficulties and hardship, but whether, if we try to, focus a little bit on what we have common, that could make any kind of, situation easier. And I think respect and tolerance is extremely important. in the sense.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, no, definitely. I think a hijab is very much a personal journey as well, and we all know that it's a big part of Islam as well. But we're also conscious of people's challenges and their own personal journeys with it as well.
And that's why I think there's a lot of the respect and the link with Islamophobia in terms of sometimes that might be a barrier to people, but the importance and the boldness, like you said, and the courage that's required in terms of to sort of be forward and back yourself basically as a Muslim man or a woman, and part of that in terms of is practicing your religion, your hijab and things, and not being put off by some of the external things, especially when there's hopefully sort of support through different organizations like Kazim was covering as well, inshallah.
Sorry guys, can I just mention something very quickly? Didn't mean to cut you off, but just on what sort of Sister Petra mentioned, I've just pulled up a quote here. So it's by Nelson Mandela in Long Walk of Freedom. So he says, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." So it kind of shows that naturally we have that sort of inbuilt, love for one another, and that sort of compassion and generosity. So like Sister Petra mentioned, inshallah, and we tell ourselves before we sort of tell anyone else, of course, that, let's all sort of have that respect and that tolerance for people of all different, backgrounds and ethnicities and religions. And, we're very lucky to be, I'm, for example, having sort of grown up in London my whole life, to have been, had friends and colleagues from all different sort of walks of life. I think that really helps in terms of instilling that tolerance and that love within us.
That's it. And we have the perfect examples in terms of the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam, headed by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in terms of to do that. So as usual, these conversations, the time just flies of how much we sort of cover, and it's been like great speaking to you guys. I think we could have gone on for a lot longer, but I think inshallah we'll probably call it there, and who knows, we may do a follow-up in future sessions and things on almost different and similar topics. I know there's the idea of people and their ambitions and some of the great achievements. So Sister Petra, you sound like you're a cycling professional, so that might be another topic that we might do in terms of how to cycle the world and survive with only 2 small backpacks.
Literally ordinary story, and it's just we got used to it. My father is 8 years old and he cycled in 50 different countries, and he's been cycling, through his life. He's got his passion for it. And it was at that time, it was just this idea that perhaps if we do something that we like, that we both like, that, we can start talking about, the different issues. And I mean, whenever I go to visit him, we would just organize, the cycling trips and different country. And for the past 2 years, we've been taking our sons as well. So it's good, it's very nice to see that that we didn't lose that contact, and we've got this good relationship. And also that my sons, they have such a good relationship with my father,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's really lovely. Yeah, mashallah.
Well, jazakumullah khair, guys.
Yeah,
thank you so much
you.
for joining us. It's been a really great conversation and very insightful. Like, we've learned a lot, both almost like on the very personal journey from yourself, Petra, and then Kazim, a lot more on sort of the practical and almost the sort of the statistics and the reality of the impact of a lot of these sort of experiences and people's sort of the day-to-day struggles. So jazakumullah khair, thank you very much. Anything else from you? Or?
No, I was just going to say that, Kazim, you've put up a website for MEND. If anyone wants to check out their work, it's iru.mend.org.uk, if anyone wants to check it out. And if anyone has any ideas for any future shows, any particular guests that you'd like us to speak to, any particular topic, then just comment on. Inshallah, we'll post this on Instagram and later on our YouTube channel. So feel free to post any suggestions that you might have. And yeah, inshallah, we'll see you on the next one. Inshallah. Take care of yourself.
Everyone, thank you, Brother Ayman and Sister Janat. Great show. Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Sister Petra.
No problem.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you both for joining.
في أمان الله. مع
في أمان الله. مع السلامة. خدا حافظ, everyone.
Thank you
Take care.
for having me. You know, it was very nice talking to you.
No,
Alhamdulillah.
it was our pleasure.
Well, thank you, everyone.